Around the turn of the century, Central Europe saw one of the largest, in some places the largest, floods in history just a couple of years apart. Countries were caught by surprise, which in many cases led to complete rethinking of flood protection, even changes in city planning, and generally in approach to dealing with water in nature. In this video, let's talk about the 1,000-year floods of 1997, 2002, and others. What happened and where? The 1997 Central European flood started very quickly after record-breaking, extreme, week-long rain in early July. The volume of water that fell down was around 50% of what normally falls in the entire year. The rain clouds were centered around eastern Czechia, but it heavily rained in the neighboring countries too. For example, Slovakia even reached historical records of rainfall. Practically everywhere below the rain clouds, there were sudden massive floods. Actually, the small rivers and streams caused the biggest surprise, with some increasing their flow well over 100 times. A little Czech town, Troubky, became a symbol of these floods. Water there has risen already during the day, but a major wave arrived in the pitch-black night because electricity was shut down. Water in the village rose by 2 meters in just 10 minutes, with the first houses, with people still inside, falling down an hour later. Around 1/4 of all buildings in the town fell down during the night, with another quarter being demolished afterwards. 9 people lost their lives in this town alone. 2 major rivers of these floods were Morava and Oder, both starting in Czechia. The river Morava caused destruction along its entire way. In some flatland areas, Morava River reached 4 kilometers in width eventually, and 800-year flow. Morava then creates country's border between Czechia and Slovakia, and further down Austria and Slovakia. So those 2 countries were hit by it too, and of course by its tributaries. Morava then flows into much larger Danube, which itself wasn't that severely overflowing, so this is where the extreme danger ended, although cities on Danube were alert. On the other side of Czechia is the Oder River. It, for example, flows through Ostrava, Czech third largest city, where, together with other rivers, it flooded 1/3 of the entire city, including many industrial zones, because Ostrava is an industrial city, washing away dangerous chemicals. Oder continues into Poland, where it becomes one of the most important rivers. Polish mountain regions near the border with eastern Czechia also saw huge rain, which caused flooding on local rivers all around. Most of that water then flows into Oder again, so Oder was already huge, leaving Czechia, and then it picked up a lot more water from Polish sources. The first major city to be hit in Poland was over 100,000 population Opole, where it was apparently the first bigger flood in almost 100 years, so the city was not well prepared. The water arrived very quickly, so many people stayed in their flooded homes. Water reached most of the city's panel housing districts, where people climbed all the way to the roofs to watch the water rising, but at least the high-rise prefabs offered safety, unlike smaller houses, from which people had to be evacuated by helicopters, while helicopters also delivered supplies to others stranded on their roofs. Zoo in Opole unfortunately lies right on the riverbank, so many animals did not survive the event. The Oder continued onward and eventually reaching the largest Polish city hit by the 97 flood, the over 600,000 population Wrocław. Citizens of Wrocław knew what's coming, since they had some 2 days to watch the news from Opole, although the media coverage was apparently somehow downplaying the danger. As the water continued, it broke through flood embankments and started flooding Wrocław's suburbs first. In the inner city, people largely stayed in their homes, built sandbag barriers, gathered supplies, and waited. Despite some of the protection measures working, around 40% of the city was eventually flooded, including, once again, some panel housing districts and parts of the old town. Oder eventually touches the German border, so German towns also started to experience the flood. First major city on the Oder River is Eisenhüttenstadt, the newly built 1950s industrial city. Oder doesn't actually flow right through it, so the city was protected by additional strengthened embankments that were continually, successfully repaired by the German army engineers. The next towns and cities were not so lucky. For example, the 60,000 population Frankfurt an der Oder and its smaller Polish neighbor Słubice, which are directly on the Oder River, so major parts of the city were flooded as well. Some 2 weeks later, more extreme rain started, causing water levels to rise once again. In Poland, it is called the Flood of 1,000 Years. 116 people lost their lives in all of the countries combined. In Czechia alone, over 2,000 buildings were destroyed, 5,000 more became uninhabitable. In Poland, 47,000 buildings were more or less affected. In Wrocław, water levels rose by 10 meters. The flood also lasted exceptionally long due to the repeated heavy rain, with some rivers retaining the extreme danger status for over a month. The safer regions watched with horror, but it's almost as if nature decided that the rest of Central Europe needs to experience it too. Just 1 year later, massive, but only local flood hit Czechia, just west of the 97 floods. In the same year, Austria and southern Germany saw floods too, and again, just 1 year later in 99, Danube overflowed in southern Germany and in Austria twice. Then there were a couple of years of quiet until 2002. First, floods hit Austria around Vienna in March, becoming the worst flood in 10 years, but the biggest flood would arrive in August 2002. The first extreme rain started falling in early August, mostly centered around southern Czechia this time, with Germany and Austria seeing heavy rain too. This would now affect the basins of Danube, Czech Vltava, and later Elbe, continuing into Germany. This extreme rain wasn't that extreme. Dams on the Vltava River freed space and caught this first wave rather successfully, at least for the cities down below. After a week, another extreme rain started, this time on much larger area, covering big part of Central Europe. Border regions between Czechia and former East Germany saw the highest rainfall ever recorded. The ground was already soaked, and dams on the Vltava River were full from before, so all this new water just went right from the fields into rivers and freely downstream. Vltava, as well as practically all rivers in western part of Czechia, quickly rose to dangerous levels. In the 30,000 population city of Písek on the Otava River, there is the oldest standing stone bridge in the country. Here it is in August 2002. If you cannot see it, then that's okay, because it's fully submerged, with only the stone statues indicating that it's still probably somewhere down there. It survived, although, as you can see, it lost its stone railing. The fact that it survived is most likely due to the recent 90s refurbishments, which included driving longer anchors into the bedrock below. Vltava River, with all that additional water from its overflowing tributaries, eventually reached Prague. The peak water flow was the highest ever recorded in the history of the city. Prague is a very hilly city. Even some districts right on the riverbank are quite tall, so you could have witnessed this flood literally standing next to the river as you normally would. Not everywhere, though. The hardest hit were districts further downstream, back in the day not exactly great neighborhoods, with some decaying old buildings where water just finished the job, but paradoxically paving the way for massive gentrification of those parts of the city. Prague's zoo was hit hard, basically completely wiped out, with many animal casualties. In the Holešovice district, Prague's metro C line was currently being extended under the river with open pit to the existing tunnel. Water got in and started flooding the C line. Elsewhere, on the B line, water broke through the tunnel walls into a station. Water eventually reached into every part of the network that was below the river, through transfer station, even into the remaining A line. Flood protection measures were already activated, but didn't work. For example, the metro has huge, thick steel gates in stations, but it was discovered that there were holes in the nearby walls for cables, where no one bothered to plug them. Almost 20 kilometers of tunnels were flooded, 18 stations and 2 trains. It was the largest metro disaster in the world, apparently, and damages were around 10% of the entire damages for the whole country for the 2002 floods. Water did not stop in Prague. It continued into all the other Czech cities, towns and villages on the way. Vltava eventually reaches Elbe, which gathered more water and caused destruction further downstream before leaving into Germany and 500,000 population Dresden. Dresden also has another little river flowing through it, the Weissenitz, which collects water from the border mountains, and like I said before, those areas saw record rainfall. So Weissenitz River would also massively overflow, and it would be the cause of massive flooding of Dresden's modern city center. We already saw this part of Dresden many times before, and exactly this part was flooded too. So the modernist commercial Prager Street and the area surrounding the main train station, which was a big construction site still in 2002. Dresden here just opened the tunnel 2 years earlier. That and the construction pits would be all totally flooded and remained flooded for a long time since water had nowhere to go. The flood also apparently somewhat accelerated the process of further rebuilding the Prager Street, as it had to be repaired after the flood anyway. Elbe then continues into the German Elbe plains, where it spilled into a very wide area. These are NASA pictures from before and during the flood. This down here is the Torgau city, some 75 kilometers further downstream from Dresden. Yeah, that's a lot of water. The 2002 extreme rain eventually covered pretty much the entire Europe, causing floods from Spain all the way to Russia. Danube River was also overflowing, although cities like Vienna, Bratislava or Budapest were doing all right. Eventually, the 2002 floods would cost 232 people their lives across Europe. But major floods also affected the region next in 2006, 2009, I was directly involved in one in 2010, and then there was a very serious flood in 2013, when Elbe in Dresden was just 1 meter below the 2002 level. And Bratislava in 2013 even measured absolute record high flow on Danube. So the most obvious question is, what's going on? Why are we suddenly seeing these major floods so frequently? Well, many answers to that question. The most obvious one is, of course, the changing climate. It just rains more. Or more specifically, it suddenly rains extremely heavily in very short time. How is that influenced by humans? The second reason is flood protection, but not quite the one that immediately comes to mind. This relates to that State of the Environment video that I did some time ago, where I only hinted how projects of the second half of the 20th century significantly altered the water behavior in nature. One big part of water projects back then was narrowing of rivers and streams and paving the riverbeds, making the paths more orderly through urban areas, but also through agricultural areas, sometimes for irrigation, on bigger rivers because of river boat traffic. So bending the river, its water to our will, literally. That proved to be a big problem, not just for flood performance, as water simply flows too quickly away from the area. Dams, on the other hand, proved to be a big help, although only to a certain degree, after which they become a serious threat. Next problem started to be heavily discussed around here since the turn of the century floods, which is water retention in nature. In other words, not letting water even reach the rivers. This is related mostly to agriculture and likely to its switch into more intensive, optimized form, where the land is simply too exhausted to accept water from heavy rain. Plus, this is especially a problem in the post-communist countries, where agriculture was collectivized and therefore fields made much larger, growing a single crop, therefore cutting down trees, forming natural barriers or channels for water, especially in mountain or hilly areas from which water continues downwards. Some floods will of course not be prevented ever, and they were happening for millennia before, so the logical thing is to simply not build in flood areas. Well, that cannot be done every time. This was, for example, mentioned by the mayor of the Czech city Olomouc on the Morava River hit by the 97 floods. He said that this freak flood is what it is if the city strictly did not build in every potential extreme flood area, emphasis on the word extreme, it would literally not expand ever. It's simply a risk that owners need to accept or find a better place. Talking about those freak floods only, of course, not the usual seasonal floods, for example. Europe, little by little, perhaps too little, although at least somehow, shows progress in measures to prevent massive floods, especially in the water-related projects of returning rivers and mostly smaller streams into their original paths, growing more natural environment around them, sort of unoptimizing them from the human perspective, but rather optimizing them for water retention. Then there is also the active protection, so all kinds of barriers. And perhaps more importantly, the rescue services, fire brigades, or even the army are much more prepared to deal with floods. As the old saying goes, experience is the best teacher, and pretty much the entire Central Europe got it firsthand around the turn of the century.